The public takes no vision of what is going off stage. If it could see the authors and settings and how historical tragedies are cooked, it would be a revelation to the public. From Colonel House's diary. On the 3rd of April 1917, a Scandinavian steamer, Christiane, entered the Canadian port of Halifax from New York. An officer on duty of the Royal Navy went aboard, found persons he was interested in among the passengers of the second class. The destination of these people was Petrograd. During the screening, they found quite a large amount of cash, US dollars, and 9 people were asked to go ashore. One of them, violently protesting, the coastal guards brought ashore on their hands. This protester was Lev Trotsky. August 21st, 1902, absconded from Verkholensk exile. The 23-year-old Leon Bronstein, being in exile with his wife Alexandra and his 2 little children. Alexander Sokolovskaya did not know at that time that this escape was an end to their joint family life. In the meantime, the absconder reached Irkutsk, where somebody had prepared not only a case with starchy clothes and ties, but a passport too. Later on, Lev Davidovich asserted that he himself, with his own hand, wrote in his new surname. It looks more presumptive that Trotsky took advantage of the stolen passport of a dead colonel. Nikolai Trotsky, from the town of Yelizavetgrad, native place of Lyuba Bronstein. Another future leader, Vladimir Ulanov, received someone else's passport. His new surname was of some Vologda lord of Manor Lenin. At that time, there were no pictures in the passports. It was enough to erase old records and write new ones. Thus, a noble name of Trotsky glued to its new owner. One fall day in the apartment of Victor Adler, a doorbell rang. Behind the door was an unknown young man. "I am Russian," said the man. "I guess. Sorry to disturb you." "Nothing. If you bring news about a revolution from Russia, you are allowed to visit me even at night." The owner of the apartment.
This is quite a well-known address in Vienna. It is known by the fact that Sigmund Freud, a Viennese psychoanalyst, a founder of the psychoanalysis school, lived and worked in here. However, it is interesting as well that in this place, Victor Adler lived too. Trotsky, initially, as far as I know, a refugee from his Siberian exile, came to Victor Adler in order for the latter to patronize and help him.
Victor Adler, a leader of Austrian Social Democrats. In 1918, he is a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria. When Trotsky becomes one of the leaders of Soviet Russia and begins to drag Austrian Social Democrats through the mud, Victor Adler will be the only exception. On closer view of Trotsky, Adler decided that he could put a stake on him. He provided him with money and necessary documents, and the Siberian absconder reached London in comfort, where under a name of the Richters Lenin and Krupskaya lived. They were looking forward for a young provincial journalist. Here in London, in the party circle, Trotsky demonstrated his essential skill of an aggressive demagogue. His quick response let him capture the idea of a speaker in order to mercilessly mock of him. Lenin appreciated this skill of Trotsky in the foreign editing board of the Iskra newspaper. Trotsky was even called the Lenin's stick. But the alliance of Lenin and Trotsky did not last long. When the Social Democrats split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Trotsky would be on the side of the Mensheviks, and for the next 14 years, they would be enemies. In Paris, where Trotsky came in 1903 as a guest propagandist for Europe, he got acquainted with Natalia Sedova, who was a party messenger. Sedova wrote her impressions about Trotsky in her diary. Paris looks like Odessa, but Odessa is better.
Natalia Sedova was a student. She was born in the Ukraine, in Poltava, and she had a lot of different problems in the institute she studied in because of negative relations with a teacher of religion. Sedova left for Paris to continue her education and was involved in the revolutionary movement. She already had a boyfriend, but she was not married. She, by the way, never married Trotsky either.
At that time, Trotsky was married to Alexandra Sokolovskaya. Trotsky's parents, who were against his interest in politics, were also against his relations with Sokolovskaya, who was addicted to Marxism. In addition, she was older than Trotsky by 7 years and from a poor family. After the arrest of their illegal circle, Lev and Alexandra had married at the presence of their relatives in the Butyrka prison. In the spring of 1904, Trotsky received an invitation from Alexander Parvus to come to Bavaria. In his mansion in the suburbs of Munich, Parvus had received Lenin and Krupskaya, and at that time he received Trotsky and Sedova. Parvus, his real name was Israel Levarovich Hilfman, a native of Russia, a German social democrat. He had connections with the influential political, financial, and military circles of the German Empire. In the artistic cafe and bars of Munich, Parvus and Trotsky were recollecting not only the city of their youth, Odessa, but also Parvus initiated his younger comrade into the secret plans of the world, or later called permanent revolution.
It is interesting to point out that Parvus and Trotsky were the first to propose not only the concept of the Soviets, which were realized in 1905 in St. Petersburg, but were the first to publicly voice the idea of a universal republic, the Mundialism, the United States of Europe, and many other ideas that were stimulated by the postulates of Illuminatism.
Trotsky had been fascinated with Broderbans while in the prison of Odessa, where there was a very good library. The research on Freemasonry interested him, as he wrote to his future wife. According to him, that 1,000-page work was later lost. This was his regret for his whole life. It was in Munich where Parvus published his first prediction: the struggle for undeveloped sources of mineral resources and new markets will lead to a world war. Such predictions were actually a part of those who were behind Parvus. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian economy was booming. The opening of the Trans-Siberian Railroad facilitated access to development of huge reserves of Siberia and the Far East. Russia was turning a dangerous competitor to the West in the Pacific region. In 1902, Britain signed a treaty with Japan, pushing the latter to war against Russia. And Parvus predicted about the soon beginning of the Russian-Japan War, which would result in a revolution in Russia.
The Japanese used $10 million.
The Japanese spent $10 million for subversive activity in Russia, 1903 to 1905.
Money itself came from a bond.
Against this money, Jacob Schiff and his banking group issued bonds of several tenders in New York.
Jacob Schiff, a head of the banking house Kuhn Lev and Company in New York. He was solidly connected with the German banking groups. He was a proponent of demolition of the Russian Empire.
The Bolsheviks, same as any other revolutionary in Russia, did not strain at contacts with the Japanese, regardless of the death of their compatriots who were fighting in Tsushima, in Port of Arthur, in Maidan, and so on. Trotsky, like Lenin, never strained at taking such money. He believed it was simple logistics. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Following his guru Parvus, just 1 year before the revolution in Russia, would prepare in 1905 a detailed plan of uprising in order to catch power using hands of the proletariat, to distract the workers from their machines and tools, bring them out of the works territories into the streets, to send them to another factory, from a factory to a factory, from a works, to involve new masses, growing and expanding and demolishing police stations and obstacles, involving the groups of people in the streets by speeches and appeals, filling up the streets. In the long run, to turn the city into a revolutionary camp. This was his plan, in particular and in the whole. After the provocation on the 9th of January, known in history as Bloody Sunday, Parvus and Trotsky understood that it was necessary to be in the hot seat in Petersburg. This is according to the idea of action. In case the uprising is victorious, the power is in the hands of those who lead the proletariat. In Vienna, in the apartment of Adler, Trotsky changed his appearance and was handed again a false passport. In October 1905, Trotsky appeared in Petersburg under the name Yanovsky. This name was not selected by accident. Yanovka was a village in the Yelizavetgradsky district, where Leon Bronstein was born. From the landlord of Yanovsky, his father, David Bronstein, purchased land, which was cultivated by hundreds of hired peasants. His father was rich and economic. Trotsky remembered, "Secretly, I used to go to the fields to hunt gophers. I cut off a paw of a killed gopher and strung it on a thread. The local authorities paid 1 kopeck for every killed gopher." From the memoirs of the friend of youth, Grigory Ziv. In December 1905, the first day I arrived in Petersburg, I met with Trotsky. It was very difficult to recognize Lev Bronstein in this elegant and imposing gentleman, who used to wear a very simple peasant shirt and other accessories of former relation. By that time, Trotsky became a deputy chairman of the Petersburg Soviet of the Workers' Deputies. The lawyer, Khrustalyov Nasayev, chaired the Soviet, who later admitted Parvus and Trotsky made him a folding screen to hide their actions. It looks paradoxically, but the Tsar supported the idea of Soviets when he appointed a commission to investigate the events of the 9th of January, Bloody Sunday. The commission proposed that the workers should have selected their representatives on behalf of the factories and works, for the representatives to openly say their demands to the authorities. Trotsky immediately threw himself to the bright light of the footlights to cheers. Trotsky knew how to excite a crowd. He liked to be a crowd puller, even for theater paradise public. At that time, like in Lenin, Trotsky was extremely businesslike. If the revolution of 1905 were a success, the leader of St. Petersburg could have been Trotsky. Indeed, Lenin at that time was a leader of a small group of Bolsheviks, but Trotsky, through the Soviet, represented all workers of Petersburg. But the uprising was suppressed. The Russian-Japanese War ended with signature of the Portsmouth Peace. The USA played a role of a peacemaker. Trotsky was arrested. In the prison in which the other accused in the case of 1905, the atmosphere was liberal. At daytime, the cells were not locked. This well-known picture was taken by the lawyer of Trotsky. In 1906, Trotsky was sentenced severely to deportation to Siberia. But in the heels of his shoes, there were golden chervonets, and runaway became just a technical issue. And again, Trotsky is in Europe, together with Parvus, who also successfully broke out from exile. And along with Natalia Sedova, Trotsky goes to have a rest in the mountains of Bohemia. Soon his memoirs about the revolution of 1905 is published, named There and Back. There means Russia. In any country, he used to feel at home. He liked Vienna most of all. There, together with Sedova, they would live for the next 8 years. In this respectable district, Trotsky would change apartments 3 times. He, Trotsky, having been an atheist, allowed his 2 sons to adopt Lutheranism as a very convenient portable religion, and his daughters from his marriage with Sokolovskaya would be taken and mothered by Trotsky's parents, and they would visit him abroad.
This is a well-known cafe, Central, which has existed for many years, approximately from the end of the one before last century. It used to be a gathering place of intelligentsia, as well as the political elite of Vienna and Austria. Trotsky, a Russian immigrant, unknown in principle to anybody, Trotsky immediately became welcomed by the political elite, some members of which later, after the downfall of monarchy in Austria, Hungary, and Germany, would occupy high positions. They would be ministers, presidents, Bundeschancellors. Later, after the revolution in Russia, the excited owner of the cafe would say, "This is a man who made revolution in Russia, but he is still in debt for coffee."
In Vienna, Trotsky became a member of the Austrian and German Social Democratic parties on recommendations of Parvus, and a correspondent of the German newspaper For Herz and publisher of Pravda.
C'était Vienne qui s'intéressait à l'Ukraine.
Vienna was strongly interested in the Ukraine, everything which was taking place there, especially non-Aboriginal people, especially non-Orthodox believers. They were of interest for special services of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is, the counterintelligence. Through the secret services of Austria, Trotsky was an informant of the Austrian Joint Staff.
Under the cover of Austrian Special Service, there was an organization of the Ukrainian separatists, Spilva. Its printed organ was the newspaper Pravda, issued in Lvov-Lemberg at that time, in the territory of Austria. But Trotsky, invited to work in this newspaper, took away its successes and launched same-name bi-weekly paper in Russian in the address of Elsin Ben Alcasa 9.
Financial aid, which Trotsky received regularly here in Vienna, used to reach around 3,000 crowns. It is a big sum for that time. An industrial worker received approximately 200 crowns per month. It was Gilfunding who introduced Trotsky into the German and Austrian Social Democrats.
Rudolf Gilfunding. He was a go-between in financing. Trotsky and Venskaya Pravda. After the downfall of the monarchy in Germany, he was appointed to the position of Minister of Finance in the Social Democratic government. In Vienna, 25 issues of Pravda was published by Trotsky. Around the newspaper, its first cadres were co-organized. Matvey Skobelev. In 1917, a minister of labor in the government of Kerensky. Moisey Ulitsky. In 1918, a chairman of Petrograd Extraordinary Committee, CHK. Adolf Felfa. After October of 1917, Trotsky's deputy in the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. Jaffa, a close friend of Trotsky, had lived in Vienna for a long time and was under medical treatment of a psychic disease by applying Freud's methods.
Trotsky was so impressed with psychoanalysis of Freud that, attending his lectures, came to a conclusion that, for us, it was remarkable that Marxism had so much in common with the teaching of Freud.
In August 1912, Trotsky had a serious scandal with Lenin.
When Lenin was publishing the Pravda newspaper in St. Petersburg, Trotsky was angry, accusing Lenin that the latter stole a name of his newspaper.
Trotsky went on rampage about illegal use of a widely promoted brand name. At that time, he tried to organize his own fractioning to set up an August bloc made up of his followers. One of them says, when alone, Trotsky considered himself higher than Lenin, but his efforts to set up his own party failed, and he, on assignment of Parvis, goes to the Balkans where a war began, the war of the Slavs and Greeks against Turkey. Parvis, by that time, had lived in Turkey for several years, quickly turning into a super influential and rich person.
Parvis was the boss. Now, Parvis
himself worked for two organizations, a secret service of Germany and intelligence service of Britain.
From the fronts of the Balkan War, Trotsky wrote and published more than 70 articles in the Kievskaya Misl, in which he cauterized the Tsarist monarchy, describing atrocities of the slaves, clearly sympathizing with the Turks. This provoked a storm of protests in the Slavic countries. The Bulgarian even prohibited him to visit the front.
The effort that Trotsky made in the Balkans.
The work which Trotsky did in the Balkans was one of a man who was interested in surveillance over troop movements, provision of armies.
From Trotsky,
his information through Parvis was provided to Chief of German Intelligence Service Walter Nicholas.
Germany.
On the 28th of June 1914, in Sarajevo, a national of Austro-Hungary, Gavril Apritsev, with several point-blank shots killed Grand Duke Franz Ferdinand, successor of the Austrian throne, and a proponent of steady peace with Russia. This was an excuse for the First World War, which was being prepared for several years. Soon, Germany and Austro-Hungary would declare war against Russia.
Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin at that time were in the territory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was one of the main enemies of Russia in the course of the war. And Lenin and Trotsky, in accordance with the martial law, were subject to detention. However, Lenin was defended by one of the most influential politicians and a deputy of the Austro-Hungarian parliament, Viktor Adler.
From the motion of Viktor Adler, Ulyanov has dedicated his entire life to the struggle against Russia.
That is why, soon after detention, Lenin was freed, and, what is interesting, Trotsky was defended by the same person.
It was Vector Adler, with support of the chief of political police, that helped Trotsky and his family to hastily leave Hungary. For more than 3 months, Trotsky lied low in neutral Switzerland. Then, under cover of accreditation from Kievskaya Mizel, he entered France as a war correspondent. In Paris, his dwelling place was the crowded street of Odessa. Trotsky began his work for 2 newspapers of different orientations.
He was appointed editor-publisher of a defeatist newspaper, Naše Slovo. France at the time was one of the main allies of Russia. That is, activity of Trotsky looks, in terms of politics, very promising. Those people who had supported 7 years of life of Trotsky in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were interested in his defeatist agitation in France through his newspaper.
For the publication of the newspaper, German money came through a common friend of Parvis and Trotsky, a Romanian socialist, Christian Arkovski. After October 1917, a national of Romania, Christian Arkovski, would be a chairman of the Council of People's Commissariats of the Ukraine. Germany allocated money to Parvis for implementation of his plan to withdraw Russia from the war by means of a revolution. Parvis gathers social democrats in neutral Switzerland, where they came from different countries. After a long break, Trotsky met Lenin. This is when the idea of transformation of the World War into a civil war through defeat of Russia was formulated. As a smokescreen, Trotsky publishes an epitaph to a living friend who disassociates from Parvis. The material situation of Trotsky significantly improved, and he and his family moved to the fashionable street of Udry. In Paris, Trotsky almost every day would visit Café La Rotonda, where one could have a nice meal and read the major European newspapers. There he had meetings with the authors of Naše Slovo, leader of the Mensheviks, Yuri Markov, the future Soviet People's Commissars, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Georgy Chekherin, Grigory Sokolnikov, and especially close to him, Vladimir Antonov Avsienko.
A French publication, L'Illustration Journal Universel. During the First World War, this publication gave coverage to the developments in the front. From this journal, we can see how excited the French society and French army were when meeting the Russian task group, which Nicholas II sent to support France in 1916.
But in the summer of 1916 in the military camp Mai, the Russian soldiers revolted and killed their officer.
Investigation established, shortly before the killing, the newspaper Naše Slovo had been widely spread and popular, which was published in Paris, and ahead of which was Leon Trotsky. The French government had established long ago surveillance over Leon Trotsky because they considered him a man dangerous for France.
The Second Bureau control over foreigners. This foreigner continues Russophobe and defeatist propaganda under suspicious circumstances. Trotsky affirms the French police that the newspaper Naše Slovo dropped into the Russian camp an agent of political police, but the evidences were so obvious that this did not help. He was arrested.
They began soliciting for Trotsky. They were high protectors in French government. He was asserted that he would be deported to Switzerland. This made Trotsky feel comfortable.
But unexpectedly, Trotsky was deported to Spain, a police prefect. To Mr. Minister of Internal Affairs, I have an honor to inform that Bronstein Trotsky, in October 30th of the current year, has been escorted up to the border of Spain by 2 agents of my prefecture. In Madrid, Trotsky still had hoped to obtain permission to enter Switzerland. He visited museums and learned some Spanish words, but his plans failed. From the letter of Trotsky to Georgy Chekherin to London, I was arrested in Madrid. 3 days of imprisonment brought me to Cadiz and told, tomorrow at 8 o'clock you will go to Havana as a criminal with 30 francs in your pocket. I have sent a cable to everyone, including you. I hope to see each other in our joint ranks. Yours, Trotsky. Georgy Chikarin. After October 1917, he will be a deputy of Trotsky in the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, and then People's Commissar. And again, some mysterious protector changed the plans of the Spanish this time.
We go back, again, according to Trotsky, he has 40 francs to his name.
As Trotsky stated, he had about 40 francs on him, and he was in Spain in prison, who in this case provided him with 4 first-class tickets for him to go together with his family to New York. If he had not had this money, then how did it appear?
From the letter of Trotsky to Moisey Yuritsky to Copenhagen, Madam J. SCH sent a cable saying that money has been sent to Cadiz. Who was the mysterious Madam J. SCH? Is it possible that she was the wife of Jacob Schiff, the above-mentioned U.S. banker? Stay of Trotsky in the U.S. provides additional evidence to support this version. Later, the go-betweens will be established in this financial chain. From a report of a secret agent of the French intelligence service, Ernst Bark passed over to Trotsky the required money to pay his and his family's trip to the United States of America. Historical reference. Ernst Bark, a nephew of the last minister of the Tsarist Russia, Pyotr Bark. Pyotr Bark lobbied interests of American National City Bank in Russia. With the beginning of the First World War, Jacob Schiff again launched an anti-Russian campaign, and when extending conditions of loans to France and Britain, he insisted for them to take commitments in writing not to transfer any part of the money to help the Russians, though they were allies.
From this very moment, it becomes obvious and undeniable that there were interferences of the banking capital, and obviously, the authorities in the person of an authorized man, who was Jacob Schiff. It was he who took the destiny of Trotsky into his hands in the United States.
However, whom could Madam J. SCH inform about transfer of money to Trotsky in Russia? Never in any of his autobiographies, Lev Davidovich told about brothers of his mother. Only once, remembering his childhood, he mentioned Uncle Abraham. Who is this man? Abraham Zhivatovsky, a member of the board and major shareholder of the Russian Asian Bank in Petersburg. Over 15 years, he covered away from an assistant of a drugstore pharmacist to a millionaire banker. During the First World War, he was arrested and accused for selling sugar and flour to the enemy, Germany, and creating food shortage in Petrograd. The brothers, Abraham and David, were mentioned in the list of a Freemasons' Lodge of St. Petersburg.
The Zhivatovskys, before the war, they were not very widely known among the business elite, which during the war, after conclusion of a contract with a Russian Asian bank, after opening a network of representations in the country from where they were exporting metal and other items required for the manufacture of arms. Even in such exotic a country as Japan, they opened their branch. Abraham Ilyich Ahivatotsky bought metals from the United States from the American Metal Company under financial assistance of the National City Bank of New York.
From a report of a French Secret Service agent, hereby it is informed that the Russian national Leon Trotsky departed December 28th on board the steamer Montserrat from Barcelona to New York with his wife and 2 children.
For all such voyages,
His names, as the names of the other passengers, were entered in a list. However, if we look through the list, then we will see that he and 3 members of his family were checked in as passengers of first class.
he also gave his address in New York.
In addition, as a place of stay in New York, Trotsky indicated Astor, an expensive hotel.
From the report of a French Secret Service agent, Mr. Trotsky, the former director of the newspaper Nasze Slovo, arrived to New York.
And it noted the fact that he was met.
Известно, что в порту его встретил человек по
It is known that in the port he was met by a man named Arthur Concourse. Concourse was an official representative of the New York Organization of Jewish Refugees and Support of Immigrants.
If again one assumed that Trotsky was
Если Троцкий приехал
If Trotsky arrived without money, then meeting of him by Concourse has a meaning. But for a passenger traveling in a first-class compartment, this is a little unusual.
Newspaper Novemir, dated 15 January 1917. Yesterday morning, on board a Spanish steamer arrived a well-known social democratic author, Comrade Trotsky, who was hunted down on initiative of the Tsarist government by France, Switzerland, and Spain. The only place of refuge for Comrade Trotsky is the United States of America.
The other interesting thing about Concourse and his organization is that
Another interesting fact about Concourse and his organization, it was a society for support of immigrants, which were funded in New York by a group of businessmen. One of the members of their consultative board was Jacob Schiff, quite an influential figure.
Interestingly enough, Jacob Schiff. But when he finds his way to New York...
Then, what is interesting, Trotsky is found in New York, where the main agent of his uncle Abraham Zivotofsky was active, Sidney Raleigh, who, this fact being more interesting, was working as an agent of William Weissman.
William Weissman, chief of the British intelligence service in North America. Till the First World War, he was a banker.
But I certainly think that it's no accident.
But I definitely think that it was not just a fortuity. This is not just an unimportant coincidence that he, in January 1917, found himself in New York and connected with such people as Weissman and Raleigh.
Sidney Raleigh acquired his wife's family name, under which he became known in the trust operation. According to some sources, during the Japanese-Russian War, he worked for the Japanese by stealing secrets for the fortification of the Port of Arthur, agent of British intelligence service, and personally of William Weissman.
In the summer of 1914,
in September 1914, in the beginning of the First World War, better to say, even just before beginning of it, Abraham Zivotofsky, uncle of Trotsky, hired Sidney Raleigh as a special trade agent and sent him first to travel along the Trans-Siberian main railroad to Japan, and then from this country to the United States in order to conclude supply contracts for military purpose. During the war, some people made money from the war. The war was very profitable for them. The purpose of the syndicate of Zivotofsky, for which Raleigh served, to make as much money from the war as much as possible.
The American office of Sidney Raleigh was located in Broadway 120. In one of the suites, together with Raleigh, worked Alexander Weinstein, who came from Russia. His brother at that time was Grigory Weinstein, who was the head of the newspaper Novy Mir, and Trotsky was sent to this office. Nicholas Bukharin was cooperating with this newspaper too. Moisey Volodarsky, Alexandra M. Kollontai, all of them after October 1917 would be appointed to high positions in the Soviet Union. Lenin informed Inessa Armand from Zurich, "I have received a letter from dear Kollontai." She wrote that Trotsky arrived and this scoundrel immediately found a common language with the rightist wing of the Novy Mir against the leftist Zimmerwald group. So this is as usual about Trotsky. He always is Trotsky, wags and cheats. Trotsky admired New York, especially his apartment in the Bronx, with a telephone in his apartment.
So if we turn to this atlas...
If you look at the Weiss Avenue on an atlas, you can find house 1522. This building was new with all conveniences of modern life, including kitchen elevators. By means of those elevators, they transported food and garbage up and down. In those houses, there was a modern system of heating, bathrooms everywhere, kitchen basins, refrigerators, and kitchen stoves.
Trotsky and his family were provided with a limousine and a driver, this having made his children happy. In the Bronx, there were many small restaurants. Trotsky especially liked one of them, Triangular, where, by the way, he made a reputation of a penny father who never gave tips. Trotsky himself explained this, saying that he did not want to abuse dignity of the workers, receiving in response from the workers incidents with split hot soup. In the New York Public Library, Trotsky studied statistics of the economic growth of the USA, which, during the war, not only got rid of debts, but turned into the largest work moneylender. The statistics of growth of American export during the war impressed me. These numbers predetermined not only interference of America into the war, but its decisive world role after the war. This export grew on the basis of war orders placing, of which the syndicate Zivotofsky, uncle of Trotsky, took part in. Not less attentive was Trotsky to the situation in Russia. In January 1917 in Petrograd, a meeting of the country's participants in the war was held. and at this meeting a plan of final defeat of the Germans and Austro-Hungary was discussed. From a letter of Colonel Hauss to the U.S. President Wilson. If the Allies win, this would mean domination of Russia on the European continent. Colonel Hauss, the closest advisor of President Wilson, the power behind the throne, as he called himself.
So one way to think of it is that
We can characterize Colonel Hauss as an agent of Wall Street in the White House who was directing activity of the president of the country.
It was Colonel Hauss who persuaded Wilson to join the war, but only after overthrow of the Russian Tsar.
So one of the things that certainly has been suggested is that
One of the proposals was to discuss secretly during the meeting of the war participating countries in January 1917 in Petrograd an issue of how to carry out a replacement of the regime in Russia.
decisions are made, and in effect, a plot is laid.
And the conspirators began acting. They provoked a crisis in the country. The country suffered from shortages of bread and coal. The liberal forces, the biggest part of which quietly were gathering at meetings, quietly used this crisis to accelerate the downfall of the regime.
On the 2nd of March 1917, under pressure of the leaders of the State Duma, the Emperor and Chief Commander Nicholas II passes his authority to his brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, and the latter, in his turn, postpones it till the decision of the Constituent Assembly. The power is transferred to the provincial government. One of the first decisions of the provincial government was to amnesty all political prisoners and political immigrants. On the day of obtaining information about revolution in Russia, New York was decorated with the national flags.
Arrive la fameuse révolution.
Immediately after the February Revolution, Trotsky asked to arrange him passport documents. Everything was arranged at the highest levels, at the level of Colonel Hauss, who decidedly solved this problem, and an American passport was provided with unusual fastness.
Une régularisation, une liste en Europe. Et donc,
It was known that Wilson made a lot of mistakes, among which was issue of passport to Trotsky.
qui est
В здании дипломатической миссии российского
In the building of a diplomat, mission of the Russian state in New York, soon after the February Revolution, a strange man appeared. He was a leader of the local Bolsheviks. Leon Trotsky had demanded immediate return to his native land from the Consul General. Mr. Trotsky said, Ustinov, you must understand that you cannot teach your mother. In response, Trotsky arrogantly replied, Mr. Consul, you can understand that the time has come when we can.
когда яйца будут учить курицу.
Trotsky received the required documents in the Russian consulate to go to Russia, but there was a need for a British transit visa.
One of the things that Trotsky himself
The fact that Trotsky himself noted that when he visited the British consulate, he did not face any problem there. They welcomed him there. There he received all the required documents in order to leave New York.
The speed with which the British issued the visa was explained with participation of William Weissman, mentioned above. It is possible that Weissman helped Trotsky to receive a passport too. Weissman was an authorized person of Colonel Hauss. From a report of Weissman, marked urgently. Yesterday, Trotsky departed on board of Krestianfer. It is known for sure that Trotsky has $10,000 about him, which he received from the German socialist. The money must be used for beginning of revolution against the existent government.
Now that money, $10,000.
$10,000, which he is bringing with him today, are equal to $200,000. This is good money, but insufficient in terms of a revolution. This is token money at the political level.
Это разменная монета на политическом уровне.
Just before his departure, Trotsky, at his farewell meetings in New York, self-confidently stated, "The provincial government will not last long, and give place to the people who would carry out more decisive democratization of Russia." Trotsky left New York without paying $200 for furniture he leased against a pledge of a Solomon Asch. Later, in order to save face, Solomon Asch would say, His Excellency had to leave as fast as possible on the call of his country. leaving me as his authorized person to pay for the debt. At this time, his party rival, with the help of the German command, was sent to Russia. Trotsky had to be in a hurry. But unexpectedly, in April 3, 1917, Trotsky was left ashore by the Canadian and British sailors from the steamer Christian Afior in Halifax. Together with Trotsky, besides his family, 5 more people were detained. Nikita Mukhin, Liba Veselov, Konstantin Romanchuk, compatriot of Trotsky, Gershon Melachensky, and Grigory Chudnovsky. Grigory Chudnovsky would take an active part in the October coup and will be one of the main leaders of the storm of the Winter Palace.
Then there's the other odd thing that having let Trotsky sail, a few days later he is then
И еще одна странная вещь.
And one more strange thing, allowing Trotsky to depart from New York. In several days, he was arrested and taken ashore by the official figures by an order issued by the office of Weizmann. What's wrong?
Из офиса Вайсмана. В чем же дело?
What arguably is going on? The effort in the arrest and everything is to cover Trotsky.
Смысл ареста Троцкого состоял...
The meaning of detention of Trotsky was found in a need to hide any trace of a connection with the British, and he was represented as a German agent with German money.
Германским агентом с немецкими деньгами.
German source.
Trotsky was put in a list as Herman prisoner of war and sent him to Amherst where German officers were kept. Unlike the officers, Trotsky was freed, it is unknown why, from any work compulsory for any other prisoner of war. This provoked open dislike of the Canadian military.
So, by arresting the
Having arrested a revolutionary hero, Trotsky, for 1 month, Weizmann diverted any suspicions from Trotsky that he was a British agent. Who helped to believe this? If he worked for the British, then why did they arrest him?
То зачем они его арестовывали?
The operation coverage finished, and Trotsky continued his interrupted trip. During 1 month under arrest, press of different countries heeded an interest in him. Trotsky came back to Russia crowned with the laurels of a hero martyr. At one of the stops, he sent a cable, which would be intercepted by Russian counterintelligence, to Abraham Zhivatovsky, Petrograd. After 1 month of prison in Britain, I arrived to Petersburg on the 18th of May. Trotsky. After 10 years of absence, Leon Trotsky was coming back to Russia. At the first railroad station of Petersburg, we were waited for by a big crowd. I was talking about preparation of the second revolution, which will be ours. It was already on the second day. Trotsky settled in a big and rich apartment in Serebrovsky, a director of the Noble plant in Petrograd. Serebrovsky was in defense supplies, same as the uncle of Trotsky, Zhivatovsky, Alexander Serebrovsky. At the Soviet time, he would be ahead of some syndicate USSR and Soyuz Zoloto, Union Gold. In Petrograd, besides his uncle Zhivatovsky, his sister Olga Bronstein lived too. She was the wife of Bolshevik Leon Kamenev. It was Kamenev who started to build a bridge between Lenin and Trotsky.
Now we're approaching one of many detective stories. This is a plot related with impetuous reproachment of Lenin and Trotsky, the union between these two persons, who had been abusing each other for more than 10 years, using most unusual epithets, along with the words hypocrite and a political prostitute, were hardly the most modest.